In 2004, East Timor, a tiny island nation in Southeast Asia, was negotiating an oil and gas treaty with Australia. But a southern counterpart had a head start. East Timor's cabinet was bugged by the Australian Secret Intelligence Service. In 2012, this spying operation eventually came to light, and East Timor decided to take Australia to the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague. The island nation was ready with evidence. Their legal advisor was in contact with former intelligence agent known as Witness K, who ran the wiretapping operation. But nobody could expect how far the Australian intelligence would be willing to go to protect the nation's oil interests. When Witness K was ready to give evidence of the operation to the court at The Hague, Australian intelligence raided his home and seized his passport. They also raided the home of his lawyer, who is a citizen from the Australian Capital Territory. The Australian government at the time couldn't acquire a search warrant, but that was no factor. Instead, they used a procedural piece of an anti-terrorism law to justify the raids. Neither Witness K nor the Australian lawyer were charged with terrorism. They didn't breach any national security law. Their single charge was an act of conspiracy to reveal an intelligence operation to the public. Bernard Collary, the lawyer in question, still refuses to plead guilty to the conspiracy charges, and the government has spent $3.7 million to prosecute the lawyer and Witness K. The bugging of East Timor is a global embarrassment for Australia. It is a perfect case study of an abuse of power, arrogant diplomacy, and Australia's urge for backstabbing. Australia prevented a witness from attending an international trial and destroyed an office of an attorney, all for the sake of grabbing cheap oil from an impoverished nation. Australian intelligence is one of the most powerful entities in the world. It has the least amount of oversight out of all democratic nations. The law doesn't grant Australian public the right to know about any intelligence operation, current or past ones. The Parliamentary Joint Committee of Intelligence Security can only review policy, legislation, and budget issues. Disclosing information about operations is done solely at the discretion of the Australian intelligence. Any unauthorized disclosure from public servants or intelligence officers can lead to 10 years of imprisonment. Equivalent committees in the USA, Canada, UK, or New Zealand have the powers to review ongoing operations of their intelligence bodies. But in Australia, spies are entrusted to review themselves. No Edward Snowden or Julian Assange could ever come out of Australia, because even reporting journalists would be charged with the same crimes as whistleblowers. All attempts to limit intelligence powers have been quickly shut down before they could even reach parliamentary hearings. During the 2 years of the pandemic, Australian government expanded its powers to the point it rivals those behind the Great Firewall of China. This is how Australia, once a much appraised liberal democracy, descended into a full-blown police state. On March 16, 2020, Victoria, the most densely populated state in Australia, declared a state of emergency. According to the Public Health and Wellbeing Act, state of emergency grants police powers to direct people's movement, enter any premises, and detain any person as considered necessary. Those powers alone vastly limited Victorians' property rights, privacy, and freedom of assembly. But that wasn't enough. On August 2, 2020, Victoria declared a state of disaster. In addition to the emergency powers, a state of disaster allows the police to take possession or use anyone's property, compel evacuations, and control people's entry to and from disaster areas. The devil in the detail here is that the disaster area covered the entire state of Victoria with over 6 million inhabitants. The state of disaster puts the Minister of Police in charge of directing and coordinating activities of all government bodies. The minister can allocate resources and direct any agency to perform any act. It also allows the police to suspend any law that could contradict with the response to the disaster. Victorian government suspended its parliament to prevent the spread of COVID-19. This allowed the government to announce an indefinite curfew and handle quarantine restrictions with no public or political scrutiny. As one scholar observed, to put this in context, federal and state parliaments sat during both world wars and the Spanish flu, and the curfews have never been imposed. A year later, the states of Victoria, New South Wales, and South Australia launched a trial facial recognition home quarantine software. The software is a mobile app that lets police verify people under quarantine mandates stay at home. People have to respond to random check-in requests by taking a selfie at their address and send the image embedded with precise location data to the police. If they fail to respond within 15 minutes or the image doesn't match with their facial signature, police officers will check up in person. This is being sold to 2/3 of Australia's population as a major improvement. Under the current rules, Australians returning home have to quarantine in hotels or state-provided quarantine camps. With facial recognition apps, they could be surveilled in the comforts of their own homes. The state could save police time by reducing in-person checkups. Because who needs KGB agents when you have people willingly spending their own money to buy advanced tracking devices? This is brave new Australia. Australia's descent into police state didn't begin during the pandemic. It started with 9/11. Pandemic just accelerated trends to the next level. In the aftermath of the attacks, series of laws gradually expanded surveillance and police powers of intelligence and law enforcement agencies. For years, Australian Security Intelligence Organisation held powers of compulsory questioning. After obtaining consent from the Attorney General and a warrant from a judge, the spying agency could detain and question people in relation to potential acts of terrorism. During the pandemic, a new bill expanded compulsory questioning in every direction. First, investigators would only need to obtain approval from the Attorney General without requesting a warrant from a judge. In an emergency, Attorney General could issue approvals orally. Furthermore, to use dedicated tracking devices, ASIO only needs internal authorization instead of a warrant. Additionally, compulsory questioning was broadened to include espionage, politically motivated violence, and acts of foreign interference. And finally, spies can now question minors as young as 14 years old. Nothing to see here, so let's move on. Spies aren't the only ones drowning in power. Federal law enforcement also saw major giveaways. To fight online crime, the pandemic saw another law passed called Identify and Disrupt. This one grants 3 immense powers to the Australian Federal Police and Australian Criminal Intelligence Commission. Disruption warrant gives the feds power to modify, delete, copy, or edit any data as they deem necessary. Network activity warrant allows them to intercept any computer networks that might likely be used by a target person and monitor their activities. Account takeover warrant grants federal agencies power to take complete control over target accounts. They can use it to log into people's accounts or lock them out. These latest powers aren't new to Australia. Intelligence agencies have had them for years to be used in the interest of national security. In 2014, Australian Parliament passed an amendment to the national security legislation with a new wording that allows ASIO to obtain a single warrant to wiretap the entire internet. The amendment intentionally defines a computer such that it includes all computers operating in a network of a target. Any target person using the internet is using a network of computers, which makes the whole internet the target of intelligence operations. Australian spies can now legally access, modify, and delete files, install malware, gain higher privileges, and monitor or impersonate people on any device connected to the internet anywhere in the world. Intelligence officers can attack third-party networks and computers and use them to direct attacks on others. In practice, Australian agents can legally hack into your device and use it for a global botnet attack, and you can better take it and shut up about it. Any Australian that travels abroad can be under surveillance without a warrant or ministerial approval. In addition to the single warrant mass surveillance, the law now punishes any disclosure of intelligence operations by government employees to journalists or others by up to 10 years of prison time. Since 2015, a new amendment now mandates data retention for telecommunication and internet service providers. All of your browsing history, phone calls, text, and email metadata have to be stored in Australia for 2 years. But all of that is nothing compared to what came next. Dubbed as the Anti-Encryption Law, a new act now enables any law enforcement or intelligence agency in Australia to request data collection from companies under threat of hefty fines or imprisonment. The law now defines 2 compulsory notices and 1 voluntary request. A technical assistance notice can mandate a company to give access to consumer data they already hold. Any company can be required to secretly lock data on any user without a warrant. This is a death sentence for VPN providers in Australia. If a government agency needs additional data a specific company cannot provide yet, a technical capability notice will mandate them to build new surveillance tools to collect that data. Police could force Facebook to send you a notification to update your WhatsApp that instead of providing new features would give the police access to your messages. They could request Apple or Amazon to modify their Siri or Alexa assistants such that they record audio in the background or generate a phishing website. This law is so extreme that Australia now poses a global security threat to the entire internet. Any encryption backdoor intended for targeted individuals would be a backdoor on everyone else using that service. Once these backdoor tools are actively used by government agencies, they could be easily leaked to or captured by malicious hackers. The most Orwellian aspect of the law is that Australian agencies can send notices not just to companies, but also their individual employees. The law bars them from disclosing or discussing these requests with others under threat of 5 years in jail. Any tech company with employees in Australia could be hijacked by their own workers and their bosses wouldn't have a clue. The amendment has a clause against introducing a systemic weakness that is meant to limit introduction of universal encryption backdoor. But the limit is in the phrase whole class of technology, which doesn't have any actual definition or meaning. The legal text expands target technology to include a carriage service, electronic service, software update, customer equipment, and data processing device. That includes anything that is on or inside your phone, including the phone itself. In other words, Australian government is now the Chuck Norris of surveillance. Any reason that is in the interest of Australia's national security, foreign relations, or economic well-being of the nation can be the reason for your device to become the target of Australian surveillance. So, for example, any end-to-end encrypted messaging platform can be forced to give Australian government special access to your messages. Your communication would still remain end-to-end encrypted. It would just have more ends between which it is encrypted. It wouldn't be just you and your contacts, but also an investigator in Australia could be reading your encrypted text. The only realistic expectation from the systemic weakness clause is that it's okay to introduce backdoor into a messaging platform like WhatsApp, iMessage, or Signal, but a backdoor into an end-to-end encryption protocol that expands beyond one company or a service is not allowed. This still means Australian police can legally wiretap billions of users of the most popular messaging platforms without a single warrant. But billions of people is not enough as long as it doesn't include everybody. None of the aforementioned safeguards apply to the technical assistance request, which is the only voluntary form of cooperation on the bill. This one, however, means companies can willingly provide special access to their customer data in absolute secrecy. It would never be a matter of any record, and all that systemic weakness nonsense is gone. No limits apply to these requests. As long as the cooperation is voluntary and not mandated, companies can secretly work with the government to compromise entire internet technologies. The million-dollar question is whether there are any companies willing to do this, and if so, what do they get in return? We'll never get an answer to this question because any government employee disclosing this information would spend 10 years in jail, and any private individual would be their cellmate for 5 years. That applies, of course, to all the journalists thoughtful enough to report on it. Nobody is allowed to say anything about Australia's intelligence operations. It gives the phrase an elite class a whole new meaning. It throws the concept of equality under the law out of the window. Nobody has more power with less oversight than Australian intelligence. If you think none of this affects you because you don't live in Australia, remember that Australia is a member of the Five Eyes Surveillance Alliance. It's a data sharing and intelligence partnership with USA, Canada, UK, and New Zealand. any surveillance capability in one member state is shared with all the others. Five Eyes is as powerful as its strongest partner, even if domestic privacy laws limit capabilities in other countries. Australian intelligence also bypasses European GDPR because the EU legislation doesn't prohibit legal data collection by government authorities. Privacy advocates, activists, and the big tech oppose this law fiercely, but to no avail. Australia is going her own way. The country became a media darling for their handling of the pandemic, with very few asking the right questions about how far they were willing to go to keep their numbers low. Australia put all of its eggs into the zero-case strategy basket. The country went through cascades of strict lockdowns, mask mandates, and travel bans until the number of reported cases went down to zero. This strategy managed to keep hospitalization and mortality rates extremely low compared to Europe or North America. But the ban on international travel went as far as preventing Australian citizens from coming back home, and those that were home were not allowed to leave the country. These lockdowns and travel bans lasted for months on end. Some Australians who got stuck in foreign countries and contracted the virus died abroad because they couldn't return home. Residents who ordinarily live abroad but stayed in Australia during the pandemic often got stuck in the country, unable to leave without a special exemption only few were likely to get. This radical approach was in clear violation of the basic human right to leave the country without establishing a purpose or reason. But human rights must take a step back when the government failed to vaccinate its population at a sufficient rate. During the time Israel, the UK, or the US had vaccinated half of their population, Australia inoculated only 3% of her adults. With more than half of the population in constant lockdowns at one point or another, Australia had ample time to immunize its population of 26 million way before the Delta variant began hammering the country. Instead, the blame is passed onto the citizens, who are subject to drone surveillance, quarantine camps, and military deployments in the streets to enforce the restrictions. Australians are barred from assembling publicly, with police cracking down on protests with huge force and massive fines. In Victoria, a single crackdown on protesters collected over $1.2 million from 236 fines. In Sydney, police blocked private and public transport into the city centre to prevent protesters from gathering in numbers. The dream of Australian success is fading away as trading human rights for safety failed to pay for itself. Australia has empty shelves, not because of pandemic disruptions, but because the government is holding too many key workers in quarantine. Thousands of supermarket employees have been forced into self-isolation or quarantine, causing massive shortages on the shelves. There is plenty of food in Australia. There just isn't enough people to distribute it. With hundreds of workers forced into self-isolation, Australia Post had to pause fulfillment in 3 states because of record-breaking backlogs and staff limitations. As the country is now at the brink of a historic recession, the only thing Australia's turnkey totalitarianism was able to deliver is a less accountable government, more powerful police, and a more Orwellian surveillance state. Accountability is a key component of a functioning democracy. Human rights won't survive if people aren't allowed to oppose their own government with free speech and peaceful assembly. Australia will survive this pandemic, but democracy in Australia might not. A lot of hours went into researching and making of this video. As an independent voice, this channel won't survive without your help. Please engage with likes and comments and contribute to my Patreon to gain access to my bi-weekly podcast. Thank you.